Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Melman in Highland Park at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation Anshei Kodesh. Joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Solomon Schechter Day School, Long Island, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanowski of Anshei Chesed in New York City. It's great to see you both. We have an amazing Parsha, as we do always, Parasha Mishpatim. If Parasha Yitro wasn't good enough, didn't give us enough mitzvot, now comes Mishpatim. And it starts, Ve'ele HaMishpatim, Ve'ele HaMishpatim, and these are the, translate Mishpatim for me. Barry, Mishpatim, statutes?
Conventionally, there are laws that can be explained, rational law.
Okay, and the place of the laws in the order of the Torah now is after the great moment at Sinai, the moment in which I would read it as the people were terrified. They didn't really hear what was going on. And they said, Moses, we can't handle it. You go up. You talk to God. And Moses talks to God. And in the experience, this is what is being conveyed to Moses. Barry, the first Rashi on this kind of extends and kind of makes the argument for us that this is a continuation. Just want to shape our thinking about this parsha with that first Rashi.
So the first Rashi picks up on the very first word, ba'ela, and he notes that kol makom shenemar ela pasawata rishonim, ba'ela mosef ala rishonim. When the text uses the word ela, that's to invalidate what's going to come afterwards. When it says ba'ela, it's going to add on what came before it, so that the way Rashi is reading the juxtaposition of Yitro and Mishpatim, the revelation at Mount Sinai, the giving of the Ten Commandments, and the Mishpatim, the Parsha that comes afterwards, is part of the Sinai revelation as well.
Okay. So this is part of the Sinai revelation. I would also add that then homiletically, in a way, it says, it validates the idea that the potential for successive generations to be better than the first generation. Of course, I used that idea at my son's bar mitzvah, which was this parsha. Okay, the first content.
Wait, before we leave the first verse and the first Rashi in the first verse, or I think it's actually the second Rashi. Tasim lifnehem, you shall place before them, and as a matter of fact, the word lasim, the expression to place before somebody, is typically about like putting food, like serving food. And Rashi says about this, Moses, you're going to teach these people. You're not just going to mention it and tell them to look it up. You're going to really teach them 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, until you put them before them, kishulchan aruch, like a set table. And that's where the obviously where the major Jewish law. I think Rashi says it, but I think it's a midrash. But
it's from the Mechelta.
It's drawing on the earlier midrash. But this is this example of that beautiful turn of phrase that reverberates through Jewish literature. This is the Shulchan Aruch. These are the laws set before you, so you know how to live as a Jew.
So what do you make of the fact that the first subject that the Parsha deals with is the Eved Ivri, Ki tikne Eved Ivri, if you acquire a Hebrew slave. Shesh shanim yavod, the slave will work for you for 6 years, Uvashvi'it yetze lachovshi chinam. And on the 7th year, the slave will go free. So what do you make of the fact that this is the first law of what we call the covenant code, after the experience of Sinai and the experience of Yetziat Mitzrayim? Barry, you have a thought about that?
Yes. So I think that what's important to note here is that the Torah is not talking about the institution of slavery, but about someone whose circumstance has led him into slavery. And suddenly slavery can become the answer to the problem rather than the problem itself. The Torah here doesn't condemn what chattel slavery, which we know from our pre-Civil War period, but is talking about individuals who might see themselves might see themselves become slaves because of circumstances sometimes beyond their control, and that could be seen to be appealing. And the Torah circumscribes this because slavery is not a good thing for the Israelite people. The meaning of the Exodus, and this is going to come up a couple of times in the Parsha, is that no Israelite should ever be a slave.
Jeremy,
Yeah, I don't entirely agree with that because I think that, okay, first of all, you are certainly 100% correct that we're not talking about chattel slavery. Nobody should be happy about this, but in the end of the book of Leviticus, it explains that you can have chattel slavery of non-Jews, but you are limited. As Maimonides says, the Torah permits something that is not optimal behavior, and hopefully it'll educate us to move beyond that. That's Maimonides' interpretation of chattel slavery. But I think that this part is not valenced negatively. In fact, I think it's valenced positively because, as you said correctly, the Israelites say we don't want people to have to be in economic straits. We don't want people to be desperately poor. We don't want people to have to go to imprisonment as debt slavery. But when those things happen, and this is a very realistic book, right? Like the Torah is not a utopian book. It's a realistic book. And there's going to be wealth, and there's going to be poverty, and there's going to be serious debt. And wealthy people, you've got to take care of the crisis, people in crisis. So no, it's not good. And no, you shouldn't just opt for slavery. But in the realities of people suffering, if there's going to be debt slavery, and there is, you have to treat it, you have to reshape it so it's a benevolent institution in which rich people take care of poor people.
So I want to add.
So what
Go ahead.
I just wanted to add to what you said, Jeremy, that we often think of these laws here as being a limitation on the slave owner, on the master. And I think we have to keep in mind that they're also directed to the Israelite slave as well. So your comments were certainly on the mark, but I think that part of what's going on here is that the Israelite slave is being addressed too. He can only be a slave for 6 years, right? That's the ideal, so to speak, and not to be a slave longer. He should not get so used to it that he thinks that he's actually doing something good for himself.
So what I want to say here is that I think the Torah is trying to find this, to walk this tightrope, which accepts the economic realities of the pre-modern world, but also undermines the institution, because it's in nobody's interest to acquire slaves if there's going to be this constant rhythm of of emancipating your slave on the 7th year. And I think we get the hint of that already back last week in the commandment for Shabbat, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, that we remember the Sabbath day. And then of course it says, Lo tesakom lacha, you should not do any work. Ata uvin chovitecha, you, your son, your daughter, avdecha va'amatcha. So your male and female slave also have the obligation to rest on Shabbat. In other words, the slave and the maid servant has a taste of freedom every week, and that undermines slavery. And so built into the idea of slavery is the Torah's own way of undermining it, notwithstanding the fact that it sets out possibilities that, as you said, that the slave could actually get to like this and want to stay with the master. And in order to do that, he has to, they perform a kind of piercing on the slave. Veratza et adonav et ozno. He's got to bore a hole in his ear. But vavadolam, and later on we'll get in the book of Leviticus the rules, the releasing the slave on the Jubilee year. Okay, so I don't focus too much on that, but there are lots of laws in this covenant code. And we were talking about a few of them beforehand. So I'm gonna randomly pick a few that we talked about, and maybe get your help on this. So here, let's take an easy one. It's chapter 22, verse 20. We may have talked about this before. V'ger lo toneh v'lo tilchatzenu. Chapter 22, verse 20. The stranger you shall not abuse. V'lo tilchatzenu. Do not oppress. Gerim heyitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. Because you were yourselves gerim in the land of Egypt. And so we may have talked about this on a previous occasion, but it's always worth pointing out that there's an ethical dimension here in these laws. Jeremy, you want to look at that?
I want to just look. I'm looking at the. I'm turning here because I'm looking at this Parsha on Safari on a different computer here, and note in 22. Ger lo ton, as you said, lo tzenu, don't wrong the stranger, don't oppress them. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. Kol almana viatom lo te'anun. Do not mistreat any widow or orphan. Im aneta aneoto ki im tsaoki tsakelai shamoa eshma ta'akato. Each in verse 22, you have three verbs, but each of them have that infinitive absolute. The doubled, which signifies in biblical Hebrew, very serious. So you would have to. And so Rabbeinu Bachya was a commentator who lived in Spain in the latter 13th. He was a student of the Ramban, although maybe not personally, but in the same general school. And he says about this. I don't know. He may be taking this from somewhere else, but he says about this. If you mistreat them at all, whatsoever, even a little bit, that's the doubled verb. And if they even give a little peep of complaint, shamoa eshma, I will absolutely surely hear. On that literary level, I think he did a beautiful job of like figuring out something unique about that verse. Even the teeniest bit of oppression, and even the teeniest bit of a cry and suffering will elicit very, very acute divine hearing, and God will get you.
So to add here to what Jeremy said, that the first thing to note here is that it extends the meaning of the Exodus. The Exodus is not ancient history. It's not something that happened to our ancestors, but it's something that we have to have happen today. We have to incorporate the lessons of the Exodus today by how we behave today, not by simply recalling what happened to our ancestors. The other thing that's important to note is what is going to happen if we act like the Egyptian slave masters. The people are going to cry out, and that's what set the original Exodus in motion. God heard the people's cry. And so it's a kind of warning to us as well that if we afflict other people, God will redeem them from us.
Wow, you give me a great sermon topic for the Shabbos. Okay, great.
My pleasure.
Tzaka is also, it's a motif that comes up a few verses later. Look at verse 26, right? It's talking about maligning the person who works for you.
A debtor.
The debtor, right? I'm sorry. So taking advantage of a debtor. It said ki ksuto levada. That's referring to the person's clothing. He sim lato leoro, taking advantage of his clothing. Bamei yishkav. It's what he sleeps in. Vaya ki yitzak, and if he screams to me, v'shamati, I will hear him. Ki chanun ani. So again, we have this idea.
This part of this, I like this part a lot. First of all, we'll give a little shout out just to my buddy and our colleague David Rosen, who's the executive director of the Hebrew Filon Society in New York. They always make a big deal out of Parasha Mishpatim because of verse 24 in this passage we're reading right now. Im kesat salvet ami etani imach lo tielo kinoshe lo tisimun alav nesher. If you're going to lend money to my people, who this poor person who is among you, do not act like a impatient creditor. Don't extort interest from them. And if you take as collateral their clothing, as you started to say, Elliot, you got to give it to them back before the sun sets, because this is the only thing. And the Torah says that beautifully. What's he going to sleep in? Like it just speaks to you in this wonderfully colloquial way. What's he going to sleep in? And it's interesting that, I don't know exactly if I can prove this down the line, but it's pretty clear to me from this and some other passages that Deuteronomy, for example, ta'avitenu de machzoro. it's pretty clear that tzedakah in the biblical times was a loan, not a gift. Like we tend to think of tzedakah as the gift of money, but as this passage says, it's really, I think the baseline was a loan. I mean, why was it the case that they simply, that even the wealthy people were too economically insecure? They didn't have 401ks, they didn't have, index funds, and even the wealthy people may have been too economically insecure to just give it away. I don't know if that's it or something else, but the principal way of wealthy people helping poor people, I think, was loans.
Fascinating. It's all about human responsiveness and God's responsiveness. I don't know if the next set of verses really capture this idea. We talked a little bit about it before, in the context of the next set, which is Elohim lo tekalel, do not curse God, v'nasi b'amcha lo ta'or, a leader of your nation you shall not curse. And in there it says, it makes reference to the kind of offerings that you need to make, the firstborn of your flocks. Anshei Kodesh tiunli. You shall be people, I'm translating here, people of the holy, not holy people, but people of the holy. And here focusing on, I think it says the first iteration of a dietary law. In other words, living your life, you have to be aware of a holy aspect of your life. And Jeremy, if you just kind of recall for us the comment and Ramban, Nachmanides on that, you mentioned it before. I don't know if you pull it up there.
Before we were recording, I was looking at the Ramban on that, and what does this have to do about what the people of the holy, that you not eat roadkill, essentially. Yeah. Roadkill's basar basadeh trefa, torn. You came like the wolf came, ripped open the sheep, and there's still some edible stuff there. No, that's not the way Jews eat animals. There's a slaughtering process and everything. And Nachmanides says, that there are certain kinds of behaviors which just make you a crude person. They make you a diminished, and they leave their mark on you, that you become like a little bit like an animal. And his comment is that Anshei Kodesh, you should be people who are worthy of the sacred mission. And there's a certain way that you eat that can enhance your capacity for being worthy of the sacred mission, and having he uses the word devekut, that you have a cleaving to God. And there are certain kinds of behaviors that diminish your spiritual capacity.
So, Elliot, you took a homiletic license earlier, so I will do so now.
Good.
So the way you're reading Anshei Kodesh is that the men of the holy, or the people of the holy, suggests that we understand Kodesh here as a kinui, as a name for God. And what it's to call is to be God's people. Yeah. And the lesson here is that in order to be fully human, we can't just be human, but we must belong to God as well.
Interesting. Jeremy, you're sure Anshei Chesed. Anshei Kodesh, Anshei Chesed. You're the people of
love and kindness.
The people of
love people. But you're the people of truth. And that was last week's part.
That's right. We have Anshei Emet in our name. Anshei Emet, we're the people of truth. You're the people of love.
People with love people. No, but you was last week when Yitro gives Moses all the instructions. He says you have to be Anshei Emet Sonei Batza. You have to be honest people who are not out for a buck.
Okay. All right. So we've dipped into the law here, and a great theme of thinking about this is that all these laws are tied to human life, and when you think about law and you think about the way law works in life, it just builds so many stories. It creates so many stories, and we can imagine, and of course the rabbis do imagine, build half the Talmud off of this parsha. I wouldn't half the Talmud, but major tractates of the Talmud are based on just single verses of these chapters. But let's go now back into the story. We're at Mount Sinai. Moses has gone up. Moses is coming down. It came down, and it says, Vayisaper la'am et kol divrei Adonai, chapter 24, verse 3. Moses tells all of the words of God, ve'et kol mishpatim, and all the laws, which we're going to interpret here as saying, Moses is relaying the commandments, the 10 statements, and also these laws. And the people respond, Vayan kol ha'am, kol echad, vayomru, they speak in one voice, Kol advarim asher diber Adonai na'aseh. We will do this. We will do everything that God says. So it's a kind of affirmation. I would say in the context of what's going to happen now, it's a preliminary ratification of what essentially is a covenantal statement. Okay? And then Moses writes it down, and we get this is why I'm so drawn to this, because it's very rabbinic, it's very ceremonial. There's a lot of pageantry here. Moses writes it down, gets up in the morning, builds an altar at the foot of the mountain, 12 stones, has the young men of Israel bring sacrifices, olot, and zevachim, offerings, takes half of the blood, places it in basins, and another half he consecrates he uses it to consecrate the altar. He takes Sefer Abrit, which is the text of the covenant, and he speaks it be'oznei ha'am, very, very literally, puts it like into their ears. Vayomru kol asher diber Adonai na'aseh v'nishma. And these are, of course, words that are known to us. Everything that God has said, na'aseh v'nishma, we will do, and we will. Give me your best translation. V'na'aseh v'nishma, na'aseh we will do and we will hear, we will do and we will obey. What do you think?
Obey.
Understand. I'm going to go homiletical too. I think that semantically, obey is probably right, but understand is like I hear you. That's like one of the idiomatic uses of lishmoa, and I get it, and I think that it's going to lead us not only to obedience, but it's going to lead us to consciousness transformation, understanding.
Right. To push the homily is that we're going to do things not because we don't understand them, as some other people have said, but we're going to do it in order to understand it, and because we do understand it.
So I love those interpretations, but I'm in such a literal frame of mind when it comes to.
Well, it's a book after all.
It's a book, but reading in the plainest sense, which is okay. We didn't hear you. We didn't get such a good listen on the first round, and we got to. We actually have to apprehend what you are saying. We have to hear this. Naaseh, we get the basics, but we got to hear it again, and maybe there's this term, this kind of Latin term, or is it Greek term, hysteron proteron, which is like when you say things backwards, right? Your socks and shoes, or shoes and put on your shoes and socks. Okay, so that's an inversion of what you would normally say. You put on your shoes.
It's raining dogs and cats.
What's that?
It's raining dogs and cats.
No, there's a whole theory about this. What is it called? It's called hysteron pyron. It's like, here, I die, I faint, I fall.
Right, because you put your socks on before your shoes. That's the point.
It's against the natural order. Okay, so this is an example of that. But there's something to be said in light of the reading that I've been influenced by over the last couple of weeks, which is that they really didn't hear. And so they really want another chance to hear it. Naaseh v'nishma. Okay, so we're coming up to the end. Moses, the elders, and the people are situated now. They all have different experiences. So God, at the end of the parsha, has a coda. God says to Moses, "Come up to the mountain and be there. I'm going to give you the tablet of stone, v'torah v'mitzvah, and the teaching and the commandment, asher katafti, that I wrote, in order for you to teach them." So Moses and Joshua go, and they get up and they go to the mountain, and they leave the elders there, and Moses goes up the mountain. The cloud comes over the mountain. and God dwells, the glory of God, or God's presence dwells on the mountain, and it covers the mountain for 6 days. And on the seventh day, God calls Moses from the cloud. And what the presence of God looks like a consuming fire on the head of the mountain before all of Israel. Moses goes into the cloud, goes up the mountain. Moses is there for 40 days and 40 nights. So I want to make a comment here that the vision of the mountain as on fire, a consuming fire, is the complete contrast to the first vision that Moses has of a fire that is not ukal. And I want to say, based on Yoram Azoni, he's saying that the vision of God and the bush being not consumed is actually an allegory for the way that God can live within a community. God is such a powerful presence. God is such an overwhelming presence as a fire. It can be so destructive, but God also gives life. And Judaism is all about bringing that flame and yet minding the boundaries so that you're not going to be consumed by that. You're not going to be destroyed by that. And I think a lot of the Torah can be read in terms of understanding that God is so powerful and yet accessible, right? And this played itself out in Jewish life. Go ahead, Jeremy.
So I like that as a description of the snapback from Exodus 3, but here we are in Exodus 24, and there's a way in which that little miniature revelation. We were talking before the call before we started recording about what's in Revelation. Is it just the divine presence? Modern people maybe are more aligned to thinking that mystical experience of the divine presence, and maybe we're less oriented towards thinking that God, at Revelation gave us a book and told us what to eat and told us what not to eat and told you how to handle torts in between two people who have two fields, and they but here, like Exodus chapter 3 with the burning bush, Moses gets a revelation. He gets a job, go free the slaves, and he gets divine name. I'll be what I will be, and I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you're going to come back and you're going to worship me on this mountain. Sneh, the bush, is the same word as Sinai. The Sinai is the fuller version of the mountain of the thorn bush. If that first one was this little teeny fire in one teeny little thorn bush, this one, the whole mountain is now on fire, and it's like a fully realized version of what the sneh was a little hint at. And so maybe on a literary level, not maybe on a theological level in the way you're talking about, or a religious devotion level, that we are bounded within a bush that doesn't burn up, that God's presence is managed through limits. Maybe on a literary level, there's no more limits. This is just the entire mountain is the consuming fire. It's not one bush anymore.
Interesting. I think of it also like in a different analogy, which is, God is so powerful. It's like a nuclear explosion, but you can actually harness the power in a reactor, and it could power up a whole city. And that. So the vision here is that God is so powerful, and that God so desperately wants to break through to human beings, and Israel is the instrument of that. And law and Mishpatim and the Ma'amad Har Sinai, the tablets, the 10 statements, the 10 commandments. This is the means by which we get God to live with us. That is to say, we are not consumed by the fire. And so let me ask you this question now. The Torah is not really known as a book that fills you with suspense, but what we have here is a suspense-filled moment, which is 40 days and 40 nights are happening here. Moses is going up the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So you know, what, dun, 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 stay tuned, you know. It's suspenseful, I think. What do you think? Where's the Torah leaving us here? We want to get to the next Parsha already.
Well, I think we may have to wait another week.
Or
But,
two.
you know, so you're alluding to the fact, I guess you're alluding to the fact that you know, Moses will stay there 40 days, 40 nights, and then he's going to delay coming down a little bit, and the people are going to get anxious because he's taken so long up there in the mountain, and so they build a golden calf. We could talk about this next week, but in Parshat Truma, like the very next thing that happens in the Torah here in Exodus 25 is the instructions for the tabernacle. But maybe we'll talk about this next week. But, you know, Rashi famously says, yeah, that's not what happened next. That's what happened later on. The story tells it out of order. What happened next is the golden calf. Sure.
Well, 40 days and 40 nights is a long time to wait for your leader, for the person who has embodied, you know, God and as representing God, and they do feel this kind of absence. And I think the last verse of the Parsha, it's an ominous note. The Torah, you know, Parshas are not supposed to end on a downer, but well, it's neutral maybe. I don't know. What do you think, Barry? How's it?
No, I think you said it best when you said it was suspenseful. It leaves us hanging, and we want to know what's going to happen next.
Okay.
You know, what is at the end of the 40 days and 40 nights?
Very good. Well, if our viewers and listeners want to find out what happens after 40 days, you'll join us on the next edition of Parsha Talk. We are so happy that you were able to join us for this week. We thank you for spending some time with us. And until, it's not going to be 40 days, it's going to be another 7 days. So until then, I want to say Shabbat Shalom, enjoy, and thank you for watching and listening.
Shabbat Shalom.